The tale of an independent Ethiopia, an empire, a kingdom, an African polity that escaped the scourge of European colonialism by the sheer determination of its people and even divine intervention, were you to ask some, has been a very powerful force in both the Black diaspora consciousness of the 20th century and even 21st century in the academic discourse among historians of Africa. The 1896 Battle of Adwa that frustrated Italy's efforts at joining in the looting of Africa, followed later by the 1935 occupation under Mussolini and the reinstatement of the king in exile Haile Selassie, worked together to create the quote-unquote romance of Ethiopia that, despite its historicity, exceptionalizes Ethiopia in discourses of colonialism in Africa, that of being never colonized and hence colonialism being an irrelevant framework to examine Ethiopia. However, by constellating the works of scholars of the Africanist tradition, the Latin American school, and historians of Ethiopia more broadly, I want to locate the ways in which colonialism has been defined and how Ethiopia's special non-colonized status has been dealt with, if at all. I find that in studies where Ethiopia's relationship to colonialism is considered, the conflicting faces of Ethiopia emerge, both colonizer and colonized, thus constituting three sort of general ways that scholars have portrayed Ethiopia, so victor, victim, and perpetrator. We also find that the capaciousness of the term colonialism expands as modern scholars of Ethiopia have sort of interjected and sought to challenge the idea of an independent Ethiopia. So academic discourse in the 60s and 70s on the phenomenon of colonialism is characterized by debates that affirm colonialism and its so-called benefits against those who decry it in all its forms. The colonialism in question is European colonial domination in much of the rest of the world, beginning in the late 15th century. Now, this was a topic that preoccupied the minds of academics, politicians, and liberation struggle leaders in Africa during the ideological divide that was contextualized by the Cold War. For example, in the January 1969 issue of the Journal of Contemporary History, most of the articles were concerned with highlighting the positive impacts of European colonialism, pushing back against the scholars who sort of condemned it, as well as international organizations like the Organization of African Unity, whose stated goal was to oversee the expulsion of colonialism in all its forms. This particular issue of contemporary history serves as a paradigmatic example for the ways that scholars were dealing with the question of colonialism in the mid-century at the eve of formal colonialism's end. Now, this balance sheet approach to studying colonialism, right, one that was concerned with measuring the pros and cons of the colonial impact, continued to persist in the 80s, shortly after the end of the colonial period in Africa, the formal end of a colonial period in Africa. Now, Audrey Bowen's 1987 African Perspectives on Colonialism is one such study that inherits this debate and takes a sort of middling position, that colonialism had both good and bad outcomes, and that navigating out of the bad while employing the good is the way to African development. Now, Bowen engages scholars of both tendencies in his assessment, namely Walter Rodney and T.B. Kabagere on the Africanist perspective and Gan and Duignan on the Defenders of Empire perspective. And just to be clear, Peter Duignan and L.H. Gan made their sort of polemical arguments against what they termed the post-colonial climate of opinion in their 1967 Burden of Empire, sort of talking about how colonialism, wasn't this sort of bad phenomenon that we've sort of come to decry and critique and put all our issues on, and they sort of chalk this up to what they call the post-colonial climate of opinion, this sort of like popular trend to be anti-colonial, that actually understanding benefits of colonialism and what colonialism truly means, So he engages both perspective, right, this Africanist perspective and what I've termed the Defenders of Empire perspective. Published during the end of the Cold War, Bowen's work serves as sort of one answer to the raging debate of the colonial impact, right? One that's cognizant of all its ills, but refuses to take a sort of hardline Rodneyist analysis. Now, Rodney, in his famous 1972 How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, offers a sort of unforgiving account of Europe's exploitation of Africa. it culminates in his one-armed bandit moniker that Rodney bestows on the colonial process overall, that there was nothing good about colonialism. It's this one-armed bandit that did nothing but wreak havoc on Africa, right? Back to Bohan, right? So he's not too keen to over-highlight the so-called positives of colonialism, but he does take a more sympathetic stance on where African societies without the colonial encounter were headed, almost in response to David Fieldhouse's 1983 Colonialism, where Fieldhouse argues African indigenous modernization without European interference is unlikely. Bohan sort of takes pains to note that Africans were indeed partaking in what he calls constitutional experimentation, to which the colonial process, no doubt laid waste. He gives examples of that. He particularly mentions the Fante Confederation and another one that I can't remember in this moment, but I'll include it maybe somewhere. But, he gives examples of what he terms colonial experiments that were taking place before European colonial excursion in Africa. In more recent years, however, scholars have been concerned with the material and discursive legacy of colonialism in Africa by calling back and reusing concepts introduced into the decolonial lexicon, like Nkrumah's neocolonialism and Rodney's underdevelopment. 21st century scholarship has sought to understand the continuity of colonialism in the modern era. And one example is Mark Langen's 2018 Neocolonialism and the Poverty of Development in Africa. This is one example that examines how, quote, Nkrumah's insights remain valid in many respects, right? This is directly what Langen says. Now, Langen does take note of what he thinks are, some weaknesses in Nkrumah's overall argument, but he does hold that, quote, the concept of neocolonialism, as originally proposed by Nkrumah, remains valid for the critical assessment of African countries' position within the globalized market economy. And in this book, you can see that Langen really is sort of trying to rescue neocolonialism as a phrase. He kind of critiques on how it's just been sort of démodé, or doesn't have the same academic cachet, I guess, as it used to, and it's something that's been sort of neglected in political economy, and he's sort of trying to bring it about and really be like, no, what Nkrumah said rings true in ways that we have yet to even understand, and this is my way of sort of making that argument. Now, in a similar vein, Mahmoud Mamdani also sought to sort of apprehend the colonial legacy in Africa as manifest in the institutional rather than the racial in his 1996 book, Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism. Mamdani uses what he calls decentralized despotism to define what he argues was the generic way that European rule in Africa was made manifest. There were no institutional differences in British indirect rule, French assimilation, or apartheid, since all forms of domination essentially adapted themselves in ways best to accelerate said domination. So maybe in French West Africa, it was most expedient to use French French assimilation theories to say that you too could be a Frenchman. Maybe in Southern Africa, maybe it was more expedient to have apartheid as a policy because of the rate of white settlers there, and so on with indirect rule, right? It's just these methods all compounded to colonialism, and these methods in these respective areas were ways that accelerated the colonialism as relevant and as best for that area. That's sort of how I understood it. And so because of this, Dani finds continuity in the 1920s and 1930s colonial policy and, quote, the brutal politics of authoritarianism and ethnicity in Africa in the 1980s and 1990s. So he's sort of drawing a direct line between what happened, the sort of policies that European governments had in Africa while colonies were active, and the sort of neo-colonial governments had in the 80s and 90s in Africa, through authoritarianism and through ethnic nationalism and so forth. While both Mamdani and Langen sort of advocate for and employ Africa as a valid unit of analysis, as in the continent of Africa, the former, Mamdani, focuses on colonialism at the level of civil society, and Langen on the sort of economic, right? But both of them find congruity in historian Ndlovu Gateni's 2013 Coloniality of Power in Post-Colonial Africa, where it is argued that the post-colonial presence in Africa is one vulgarized by the post-colonial neo-colonized world. Now, this is such a mouthful. But Ndlovu Gateni argues that, this post-colonial neo-colonized world is a present which is absent because what exists is not what Africans aspired for and struggled to achieve, right? So the sort of current world, even in post-independent Africa, post handing the governments to Africans and so forth, and all this good sounding stuff, this world is really a post-colonial neo-colonized world, right? So it's sort of a way that it's post-colonial in the sense that Europeans physically and their colonies no longer exist. There are new governments, right? In that sense, it's post-colonial. But it's a neo-colonized world because in this post-colonial world, formal colonialism ended and this new type began. Either way, Ndlovu Gateni is saying that this is not a situation that Africans en masse had control over. Right? This is nothing. What exists is not what Africans aspired for and struggled to achieve. So while Langen is exploring the neo-coloniality of Africa and the contemporary economic relations, be it through the proliferation of foreign companies in Africa or foreign aid and donors and so on, Ndlovu Gateni's approach explores how multifaceted themes of, quote, African identity formation, nation building, and state construction, knowledge production, economic development and democratization remain unfinished, close quote, because they exist under the auspices of this post-colonized, neo-colonized world. What I found is that, Mamdani, Langen, and Ndlovu Gateni's contributions to colonial studies sort of approach the question through various forms of unearthing colonialism's continuity, right? Sort of in different areas, but we're talking about how colonialism persisted, and all of them sort of use slightly differentiated terms, right? Langen calls back to Nkrumah's neocolonialism, and Ndlovu Gateni calls it this post-colonial neo-colonized world, and Mamdani calls it what does he call it? Decentralized despotism. But again, they're all sort of, I think, exploring the same, the different dimensions of the same, post-colonial present that Africans have found themselves in. An important facet of this continuity, however, is modernity. For example, Ndlovu Gateni credits the predicament that is a post-colonial neo-colonized world to, quote, the negative processes of Western modernity as it spread across the world, right? Now, this brings us to a really important and a big front of the scholarly debate on colonialism, right? It's sort of inextricability with modernity. That modernity finds its genesis in colonialism is a concept that was more explicitly introduced by scholars in the Latin American Modernity Colonialism Research Program. And an important researcher within this school of thought is Aníbal Quijano, who employs coloniality as a phrase rather than neo-colonialism to articulate a sort of similar process of continuity or even immutability. And by immutability, I refer to this in one quote that he has in his essay, Coloniality and Modernity / Rationality. Quijano says, coloniality then is still the most general form of domination in the world today. Once colonialism as an explicit political order was destroyed. It doesn't exhaust, obviously, the conditions nor the modes of exploitation and domination between peoples, but it hasn't ceased to be, for 500 years, their main framework. Right? Again, it's this, he's exploring this continuity, but it's also immutability as well, where it's like, its essence really hasn't changed, even if its external, means might have. At least that's my interpretation of that. But more than simple continuity, Quijano argues that while European colonial domination was consolidating itself, the cultural complex known as European modernity or rationality was being constituted. And this was not a historical coincidence, right? Quijano interjects that such confluence between coloniality and the elaboration of rationality and modernity was not in any way accidental, as is shown by the very manner in which the European paradigm of rational knowledge was elaborated. And I sort of understood this to mean that, this is because rational knowledge as it emerged in the West was one that placed other cultures as, object, right, from the self or subject that was Western Europe, right? So from the very beginning of Europe's encounter with other groups of people, what Quijano calls the very manner in which European paradigm of rational knowledge was elaborated was through that process, right? By defining of, I am this because I'm not that. This is what Europe is because Europe is not black. Europe is not what all these other cultures are doing, right? So that's how I sort of understand that to mean. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Now, another really important scholar within this school of thought is Walter Mignolo, who draws on this as he works through his 2011 Coloniality, the Darker Side of Western Modernity. Now, Mignolo credits Quijano for introducing coloniality to the decolonial lexicon and scholarly research, and argues that he, Mignolo, understands the, quote, the hidden agenda and darker side of modernity was coloniality, unquote. And this is a coloniality that he defines as the concept that articulates the underlying logic of the foundation and unfolding of Western civilization, from the Renaissance to today, of which historical colonialisms have been a constitutive, although downplayed, dimension. Hence, while one tendency explores the continuity of colonialism in an empirical sense, right, through the incrementalist tradition, another explores it through the discursive concept of modernity itself, right, one that presumably characterizes the ontological and epistemological basis that undergirds what Novu Gateni says is the African identity formation, nation building and state construction, knowledge production, economic development, democratization, all of these different things that we see being developed in this post-colonized, neo-colonized world is undergirded by this this continuity by colonialism, but again in this a discursive sense, right? Now, I've talked about all these different theorizations of what colonialism is and how it, manifests itself after its formal end. But none of the people that I mentioned are historians, right? They're not, I don't think, trained in history particularly. We have political scientists, we have political economists, but not historians. And this is where historians really come in. Now, Frederick Cooper is one such scholar. He's a historian, and in 2005 he published a book called Colonialism in Question. Now, he raises important questions about the ways in which conceptions of colonialism have been flattened to solely consider that of the European, first and foremost. Moreover, Cooper's intervention is not one about the sort of empirical legacy of colonialism, but rather about the way the historical discourse surrounding it has created what he calls a double occlusion. And this double occlusion is the occlusion of the history of the people who lived in colonies, as well as the obscuring of European history. This is what Cooper says is happening when we talk about colonialism so far. So in many ways, Cooper's work is in response to the balance sheet debates that were raging at the dusk of colonialism, as well as the ones that were concerned with unearthing how the colonial process persisted. So what Cooper wants to do is he wants to point out the dangers of thinking within the anachronistic box of the timelessness of colonial modernity, to emphasize just how historically contingent colonialism really was to begin with. This intervention essentially asks historians to think more historically about the colonial process. Now, one of the issues that he raises is the potentially problematic implications of words like coloniality. I don't think he's at all in agreement with the Latin American school. Cooper notes that it implies, quote, that there is an essence of being colonized independent of what anybody did in a colony, unquote. He terms this tendency story plucking and notes that Mignolo's deployment of coloniality falls into the trap of abstracting the colonial process from time and space. So, as a historian, it makes sense that he's making this kind of argument, right? He's not... historians theorize, they do that, but he he also wants us to talk about, what kind of colonialism are we talking about? Colonialism looked different in this area than it did in this area, than it did in that area. Its meaning might change depending on which time period you're looking at, which was the colonizing power, which was who was colonized. He wants to make all these different types of distinctions, not to minimize the sort of impact or the harm or the unifying force that might come out of being colonized. I don't think so, at least. I think he's just trying to, again, defang colonialism, I guess, or sort of take away from the mystique of it, and really, something so well, you define something so well, you understand its dimensions, its limits, and then it becomes this thing that you can really tackle, that you don't have to see this as this, like, you don't have to conceptualize it like the Latin American school, where coloniality is this sort of like abstract being, or centralized personhood, where, I guess, to Cooper's point, where modernity and everything that comes with, I guess, modern life is associated with colonialism or coloniality and so forth. I just think Cooper kind of takes issue with this totalizing way of describing something. I'm not surprised. A lot of academics don't, and I think historians even less so. I feel like, historians are always going to make the case that everything that we talk about is historically contingent, and we just gotta find the parameters for it. And I think that's what Cooper's doing ultimately. So it's not a surprising argument to come out of a historian's mouth, right? And I don't completely disagree. Like, I do think it's good to understand the different ways colonialism might have manifested itself in different places, but I am more of a Rodneyist when it comes to this. I am more maybe politically on the side of the Latin American school, where there is a unifying sort of identity or force that comes from being colonized. And then this isn't to essentialize colonialism or to essentialize identity of being colonized, but again, I do think there is a political use to that. But anyway, that's not Cooper's position, and that's that, right? But in the same vein, Anya Lumba raises the same question in her Colonialism, Post-Colonialism, where she argues that, quote, by the 1930s, colonialism had exercised its sway over 84.6% of the land surface of the globe. This fact alone reminds us that it is impossible for European colonialism to have been a monolithic operation, unquote. Again, she's not a historian. She's actually, she's a, literary critic, I think. She's in the English department. But she's making the same sort of argument that Fred Cooper is making, right? This was a process that overtook such a large part of our world. Just by that fact alone, it's not going to look the same in everywhere it manifested itself in. Now, this isn't to say that the colonial experience, were it to be experienced by someone in India or Kenya or Vietnam, is sort of inherently incomparable because of said fact. Lumba actually notes, quote, the legacies of colonialism are varied and multiple, even as they obviously share some important features, unquote. So rather, the concern is that with overgeneralization, one nears the dangers of the double occlusion that Cooper was warning against, right? But this is also why scholars like Lumba have challenged the notion of a post-colonial, in this sort of singular way, subject or status, since in reality there would be post-colonial isms, right? That is, even barring the denotative issues that prefix post indicates, right? But before one even begins to sort of unravel the complications of post-coloniality, Lumba also offers a discussion around what exactly makes the colonialism of the European kind different from its other iterations. Lumba contends that what is singular about modern European colonialism is that it, quote, restructured the economies of the colonized, drawing them into a complex relationship with their own, so that there was a flow of human and natural resources between colonized and colonial countries, unquote. And this process, argues Lumba, was necessary for the growth of European capitalism and industry. Thus, we could say that colonialism was the midwife that assisted at the birth of European capitalism, unquote. And now this is kind of funny to come across, especially with the whole other, with the whole Jacobin magazine fiasco. But Lumba's contribution then helps us think through the peculiarity and even aberration that was European colonialism because of its linkage with capitalism, right? That's what really makes the European colonial process different than what the Arabs may have done, what the Ottomans may have done, what, again, all these other civilizations that have conquered other peoples. Its ability to restructure the societies that encountered to a mode of production that made a working class of those colonized, right? What is inherent and almost essential is this definition that is the economic dimension to colonialism, but not just economic in the sense of just depriving someone of a resource or anything like that, but a whole sort of mode of production that comes out of it, which is capitalism, right? However, what Cooper articulates and Lumba echoes is a strong critique that explores the weaknesses of conceptualizing the impact of colonialism in a way that both abstracts and essentializes it to the point of being unable to sort of think outside the box of European incursion, and worse yet, unintentionally crediting modernity to European progress. Its saving grace, however, may also come from the same weakness identified in this particular critique, right? In other words, because of the capaciousness of coloniality, it can encapsulate specific cases of colonialism that do not fit neatly into colonialism's more common iteration, but are, however, inextricably linked to it. And I think this is where the specific concept of Ethiopian coloniality comes to play, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But what seems to be left out in these studies on colonial claims, mostly, is Ethiopia. In studies where Ethiopia is mentioned, it's either as a means through which to show how indeed positive colonialism was for Africa, or briefly mentioned as the only African country that signified her independence at the Battle of Adwa. And the latter analysis is the result of what scholars have termed the romance of Ethiopia, right? And it wasn't until the intervention of Ethiopian historians and academics and activists that Ethiopia's unique relationship, rather than no relationship, to colonialism was really earnestly engaged with. And this is potentially a result of the radical politics of the Ethiopian student movement of the 60s and 70s. I think this is like the third video where I've name dropped them, but I do think that's an impact of them. So one of the more controversial and earlier studies on Ethiopia's coloniality was Bonnie Holcomb and Sisai Ibsa's The Invention of Ethiopia. Now this was published in 1990, and this is a hermeneutical or sort of interpretive work that argues Ethiopia was a test case of neo-colonial rule and the product of European imperial collusion that sought to create a safe economic zone within the Horn of Africa in which stability was ensured and access to the Red Sea was guaranteed. And this sort of granted what they say, a constant flow of raw materials from the rich lands. So in a sense, Ethiopia was sort of brought into the economic aspect of neo-colonialism with the sort of extraction, but not necessarily like formally colonized with like settlements or in the way that we usually think of colonialism. So in this monograph, the authors provide an alternative understanding of the canonical narrative of Ethiopian history to highlight just how closely intertwined the development of the modern Ethiopian state is with this colonial process. However, this interpretation, and this is why I said it's controversial, this interpretation of history is one that has been strongly critiqued, particularly by historian Baharu Zawde, and he says it's an alternative history in that rather than setting out to demonstrate the invention of Ethiopia, he says Holcomb and Sisai only succeeded in inventing history. So shots fired by a historian for sure. Though Baharu only dedicates a paragraph to the invention of Ethiopia in his long review of the 100 years of Ethiopian historiography, it's likely done to sort of, to serve as a stand-in work that is representative of the kinds of histories that reflect what he calls an explicit political agenda and something that poses a challenge to quote-unquote professional historiography. So this is sort of his main argument against histories like this that say the sort of neo-colonial relationship. Either way, he's not a fan of the sort of work, is what I'm trying to say. But however controversially received, this particular intervention, challenges the mythology of ancient Ethiopia and sort of complicates the epithet of the only independent African country. It also expands the historical inquiry on foreign rule in the Horn outside of the Italian occupation, as most historical works on the Horn of Africa are, more likely to do. And so I looked at a couple of book reviews to see, how others have received the invention of Ethiopia. Now, there's a historian named Charles McClellan McClellan, I'm not really sure, who cedes in his review that there is merit in some of their arguments, specifically about the potentially overlooked roles that foreign advisors played in the Ethiopian government. However, he maintains, quote, "It is one thing to assert, but another to prove." But then again, like I said, this is a hermeneutical work. It's an interpretive work, so they're just sort of like, this could be the potential sort of way we can see how Ethiopia unfolded. So I don't know if they're trying to make a historical claim. Maybe they are. It's just not one that most people think, or most academics think, has been well sort of articulated or argued. That Holcomb and Sisa did not have the sort of traditional historical training is also one thing that a lot of reviewers didn't fail to mention. But its significance and the sort of credence and life it gave to the politically motivated ethno-nationalist histories, I don't think should be overlooked in the discourse around Ethiopia's coloniality today, especially when studies since the invention have sort of explored the visage of Ethiopia as a colonizer of self, right? So as problematic as, or as academically problematic as, even politically problematic as some have received the invention of Ethiopia, I think it does at least open sort of doors as to how we can place Ethiopia's relationship with colonialism. Okay, maybe that's a crazy claim, but whatever. That's a claim I will make for this video. Though Bauru was one of the more vocal critics of the invention, as a Rankian historian himself, right, a historian who's very all about the sort of empirical analysis of archival documented materials, his works on modern Ethiopian history are a potential example of thinking historically about the colonial process as Cooper had advised, right? In his 2001 monograph, A History of Modern Ethiopia from 1855 to 1991, Bauru argues that semi-colonial relationship existed between Ethiopia and Europe. He concedes that quote, Ethiopia's post-Adwa independence was not as absolute as tends to be assumed, unquote, but he does not go so far as to identify a particular social group for the proliferation of European or particularly Italian and even American interests in Ethiopia. This semi-colonial relationship claim is then backed with well-documented events like the Tripartite Agreement and the Anglo-Italian Understanding of 1925 that were examples of what Bauru calls European high-handedness. Bauru also cites the Kolobukowski Treaty of 1908 to support his claim about the way, quote, Ethiopia found itself under the shadow of the same imperialism that was penetrating the colonial African economy, unquote. In his more recent work on the Ethiopian student movement, which I've also talked about that book on this channel, Bauru also only concedes that the presence of American influence in the mid-century was, quote, largely confined to the political, military, and cultural spheres, rather than the economic. Through Bauru's works, then, one can sort of detect colonial or imperial designs, either from the British, Italian, and American front, in the immediate decades succeeding Adwa, be it politically, economically, and culturally, but less so economically in the latter decades of the 20th century. One of the more notable debates around foreign influence in Ethiopia was between Bauru and the philosopher Mesai Kabede, and in the quest for socialist Ethiopia, Bauru had challenged Mesai Kabede's earlier publication on the same topic in his Radicalism and Cultural Dislocation in Ethiopia. Now, among his arguments was one, and I'm talking about Mesai here, one of his arguments was about how the radicalization of the students was a product of a cultural dislocation that was caused by elitist students who were enchanted by Marxism and rejected traditional Ethiopian education, one that is administered by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church particularly. Mesai notes, quote, a cultural dislocation was induced by a Eurocentric educational system and the resultant infatuation with Marxism-Leninism, unquote. This is an argument Bauru ends up wholeheartedly rejecting, as he notes that Mesai underestimates the structural issues engendered by the imperial regime, were, a great stressor that in themselves, in addition to the, worldwide popularity of Marxism at the time, could be more valid causes for radicalization, as opposed to some form of foreign influence that displaced indigenous forms of knowledge production. However, Mesai's contribution in radicalism and cultural dislocation could have potentially opened up an avenue of discussion of just how colonialism in Ethiopia was perpetrated through education and epistemology, right, rather than the sort of economics. And so this is what I mean by like the the different dimensions of like how colonialism can be perpetrated. Ethiopia is just maybe less obvious because we're talking about schooling, we're talking about education, we're talking about epistemology, but without any real occupation, without any real guns pointed in the same way that, let's say, the French pointed the guns at the Congolese when they were doing a sort of assimilation. So it's just not as clear. So it's hard to make these kind of arguments for certain historians. But I think Mesai's work does open the door for that kind of analysis, right? This is what scholars like Elizabeth Wolde-Georgis, Riga Gelau, and Amsala Alamu engage with in their respective works of how colonialism persisted in non-colonized Ethiopia. So one of the more recent explorations of this is Elizabeth Wolde-Georgis' Modernist Art in Ethiopia. Now, this came out in 2019, and Elizabeth examines Ethiopian modernity qua colonialism through art. Right, Elizabeth argues that, quote, Ethiopian modernity and modernism are constitutive of the larger political and ideological history of modernity, unquote, by tying and basing her analysis to Mignolo's argument that coloniality is constitutive of modernity. There is no modernity without coloniality. Hence, Elizabeth's concern is not whether Ethiopia was colonized or not, but about how, regardless of colonization, there existed a power relation, quote, between Ethiopia and the West, a relationship of margin to center that was hardly free of colonial influence or domination, unquote. So modernist art is concerned with shedding light on the colonial legacy that non-colonized Ethiopia also shared, but that the dogmas of the studies of Ethiopia cast aside. So this is her argument. Here then is a sort of well-put articulation of the coloniality of a non-colonized Ethiopia. So why non-colonization as opposed to uncolonized? And how can the state of being non-colonized be mutually extant to the legacy of colonialism? Like, how can you be non-colonized but still experience colonial impacts, colonial things, right? And this is exactly what Elizabeth sort of seeks to unravel, primarily through revealing the colonial epistemes in the Ethiopian intellectual space, sort of rectifying a, I think, crucial gap within Ethiopian studies. So that's what her book is about. Just 2 years before modernist art, however, the colonial epistemes in the Ethiopian intellectual tradition were explored in Yirga Gelau and Leyes's Native Colonialism, Education and the Economy of Violence Against Traditions in Ethiopia. And here, Yirga Gelau sought to sort of answer how epistemic violences were inflicted on Ethiopian ways of knowing because of what he calls native colonialism, and how colonialism, as opposed to colonization, played a role in the development of a Western consciousness among Ethiopians. Yirga Gelau also sought to answer what forces and changes marked the transition from, quote, the conceptual and traditional basis of political and social life, unquote, to said Western consciousness. So while Elizabeth credits the proliferation of colonial epistemes to the ways Ethiopian intellectuals and state actors, quote, translated, transformed, and adopted coloniality in the making of Ethiopian modernism and modernity, Yirga Gelau argues that Ethiopia was a case of native colonialism in which, quote, a political system similar to colonialism has been instituted in the country by native colonizers, unquote. So Yirga Gelau argues that the colonialism that native actors within Ethiopia replicated is largely absent from historical accounts, and that the education that was then institutionalized is one that is alienated from Ethiopian students since it derives its epistemes from the West and not the traditional philosophic and intellectual culture that, you know, certainly exists in Ethiopia. But I don't think he particularly calls out the, you know, Ethiopian Orthodox Church as the basis of that. Like, I don't think he makes that kind of religiously essentialist argument, considering that there's a large population of non-Christians in Ethiopia, but that there is, you know, there's an indigenous sort of way of knowing. I didn't read the whole book, I'm ashamed, but I'm sure he mentioned something about, like, the, you know, Kane tradition, for example, which is an intellectual sort of tradition that comes from Ethiopia that I don't think is obviously has ties with the church and stuff, but there's a secular version of the tradition of Kane. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out, but that's not what this video is about. But Ethiopian coloniality is then best apprehended by sort of examining the subaltern region from which knowledge production and modern nation state crafting emerge. It's less a question of brute force occupation or the presence and settling of foreigners at the expense of the indigenous, right? The colonial violence in Ethiopia finds itself in the sort of amorphous realm of epistemology and ideology. And I think this is adjacent to how, Dr. Amsala Alam employs her concept of Ethiopian coloniality in her 2021 dissertation, Revolution Beyond Redemption, U.S. Empire, Student Struggle, and Ethiopian Coloniality. And so here, Amsala offers a way to conceptualize Ethiopian coloniality through her reading of the Ethiopian Revolution and the student movement, particularly the student movement in North America. So in her work, Ethiopian coloniality is a process in which, quote, an anti-monarchist revolution narrated itself as an anti-colonial movement, unquote. So this is central to Amsala's main argument that a decolonial politics was, quote, necessary to the project of the Ethiopian Revolution, unquote. Here then is another scholar attempting to sort of articulate the way coloniality manifested in a non-colonized state like Ethiopia by exploring the ensuing resistance that took on anti-colonial dimensions, right? So it's a sort of backward process of unearthing Ethiopian coloniality by scrutinizing its products. And Amsala calls this product, quote, the politics of the non-colonized, and credits it to the, quote, 3 dimensions of lived experience of the student movement. And what's unique about, this contribution is that coloniality was not solely extant in the realm of ideology and epistemology, but also had more tangible presences. These presences manifested through what she identified as the material relationships with university surveillance, state, and police power. 2, access to information as well as research, time, and relative freedom to discuss aspects of U.S. influence in Ethiopia's economy, military, and administration. And 3, personal and organizational relationships forged within and across the Black Power left, including the Black Panthers, Black arts and campus movements, Communist Labor Party, and many others. Because of these experiences, she's able to discuss how Ethiopian revolutionary thinkers transformed familiar categories of coloniality, troubling easy distinctions between anti-colonial and revolutionary movement making, unquote. What Elizabeth Amsala and Yirgagelau have offered then is a way to look at how colonialism manifested in a country that is known for successfully resisting it. So while Elizabeth and Yirgagelau explore questions around the proliferation of colonialism through modernity, epistemology, and even culture, Amsala provides one more grounded in the history of the radical student movement and the Ethiopian Revolution. Like the same students that Amsala argues pushed the boundaries of colonialism, so too do these modern scholars in attempting to unravel a seemingly timeless oxymoron. Ethiopian coloniality then is an emerging concept that scholars in various fields are engaging with to complicate the narrative that the victory at the Battle of Adwa had sort of let run rampant and, has sort of flattened, dehistoricized. So what ended up, unfolding in the country. So by engaging with and rescuing the concepts of Nkrumah and Rodney, for example, historians today are able to sort of track the continuities of colonialism. And in the case of Ethiopia, historians are not only re-examining Ethiopian history with a critical eye that no longer takes for granted the, imperial mythology that most of Ethiopian history is occupied with, but rather how the way Ethiopia has been sort of studied can itself be a signature of coloniality, right? That the framework of Ethiopian coloniality then allows historians to sort of look at a case of imperialism without empire, as well as meditate on the various sort of faces that Ethiopia's relationship to colonialism, whether as victim or perpetrator or victor, to both sort of challenge the boundaries and sort of test the capaciousness of an historical process that to this day has sort of no equal, right? We have not come out of the world within which colonialism has imposed. So that was just my brief review of the historiography about, Ethiopia's relationship to colonialism. Obviously, it's not a historiography in the strict sense of the term because it includes a lot of the contributions from non-historians because, theorizing about colonialism isn't something that a lot of historians really engage in, I don't think. If you look at a lot of the works that talk about colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, it's a lot of, we know what post-colonial studies are, we know it's cultural critiques, it's people in English departments, it's people in social theory departments that are really putting out works that are dealing with these terms and consistently applying it to the world today and sort of, reviving them and rescuing them and sort of actively using them as frameworks for analysis, whereas historians, not so much historians, live in the archives, sort of, which is part of the deal, I understand that. but I think historical work is definitely something that's enriched by engaging with these things and sort of explaining why the archives are the way that they are. You won't understand why the archives are the way that they are if you don't understand colonialism, you know. So anyway, it's an interdisciplinary historiographical sort of essay that I worked on. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I know it's a little bit over at the place, and it's the first sort of essay that has had the closest relationship to what will eventually be my dissertation. So, you know, very dipping my toes in the subject as of right now. But yeah, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed, and I hope it wasn't so goddamn confusing, because I was reading through it and I'm like, I hope I know what I'm talking about, or I hope what I'm saying makes sense. But anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks so much, and let me know what you think as always. Yeah, bye.